Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1017th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the extreme privilege and pleasure to be your MC today for a conversation featuring Jennifer T. and Barbara Pollack. And now I'll introduce Jennifer and Barbara. Jennifer T. is known for her experimental interdisciplinary practice, unencumbered by delineations in form. Traversing various media and using versatile approaches, T examines and questions cultural, psychological, and socio-political resonances and materiality as they relate to the history of migration and colonialism. She's been a resident artist at the Rijksakademie in Amsterdam and at ISCP in New York. T was awarded the Amsterdam Prize for the Arts in 2020. Recent solo exhibitions include Still Shifting, Motherfield, and others, including several group shows and biennials. T lives and works in Amsterdam. And our host today, Barbara Pollack, is co-founder and co-director of Art at a Time Like This, a platform for expression for artists and curators to respond to the most pressing issues of the 21st century. Barbara has an expertise in Asian contemporary art, and she curated the recent exhibition Mirror Image, a transformation of Chinese identity at the Asian Society Museum in New York. Her latest book, Brand New Art from China, A Generation on the Rise, is available from Bloomsbury Publishing. Pollack teaches at the SVA. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Barbara to get us started.
Now? Yes. Hi, everybody. It's a real honor to be here to have a conversation with Jennifer T., who I was not familiar with a couple of weeks ago, but then when I saw her show, I was just blown away. I mean, Jennifer, your work, if someone asked me, what kind of artist is she? It would be hard to answer in one sentence from this exhibition. There's ceramics, there's weaving, there's shadows, there's floor pieces, and of course the series, the Tampan Tulip series. And it's all extremely engaging and labor intensive, extremely labor intensive. And what struck me was that it's funny that you are trying to weave together two parts of your ancestry living in the Netherlands and also a descendant of people from Indonesia. And both of these cultures are ones that an American audience can't so easily place. I mean, maybe we think of tulips, maybe we think of weavings from Indonesia, but we don't really know that much about each of those nations here. So I wanted to know from you, at what point were you awakened to Indonesia culture, and did you feel like you needed to incorporate it into your work? Is that a good place to start?
Yeah, that's that's a good place to start. So of course, my grandparents were from Indonesia, and I was having my grandparents around and my father, of course. So it was always part of, growing up. And there were some other relatives, but we didn't grow up in a really big, like, Indonesian community. So my references were mostly my near family, my grandparents and my father. Yeah, I think through when I started to go to art school, maybe that's the moment when I started to think about, what mattered to me. And one of those things were, I think, thinking about myself and in relation to my environment and how I'm maybe perceived. And I think with the tulip works, just to start there, I sort of stumbled upon working with these Indonesian textiles through a commission that I was asked for. and in which the brief was to think about, it was like for the subway line where I was going to make a wall work. And I was asked to think about like the local and entering Amsterdam as like from abroad. And then I was thinking of the tulip and the tulip fields as something very uniquely Dutch and something that might maybe people think of if they think of going to the Netherlands. And I was also thinking of how those rows of tulips maybe resemble a weaving. And from thinking about this weaving, I was started to do some research into ceremonial textiles. And that's how I came to know these ship cloths, or these tampons, they're called. And through working on this series of works, this Tampon Tulip series, this has also been a way for me to, get to know more about Indonesia, or at least about these textiles and how they were maybe used or what they might have meant.
I think it's interesting that you went to Indonesia later when you were already a student. Is that true, or were you going since childhood?
No, I never went during childhood. My grandparents, they migrated in the 1950s after the Second World War. And a lot of Indonesians, especially maybe Chinese Indonesians, left Indonesia when Indonesia was striving for independence. And maybe Chinese Indonesians, some worked for the Dutch government during colonial times. So maybe they were not really that wanted to stay. So they sort of had to flee. And I think in their lifetime, they were never had the opportunity to go back. So basically, they had to also leave other family members, sisters and brothers, my grandparents. So they never had the opportunity to go back. And I also only went there for the first time when I was already in my 20s. And the first time was with my family, with my parents and my sister. And then later, I went again, but that was already when I started working on these tampons. And then,
what was it like to see Indonesia for the first time and to begin seeing these patterns and these textures?
yeah, so this first trip with my parents, that was more like meeting some family that was still there, and also just seeing a little bit like where my father was born, where they were from, was sort of like a back to the roots kind of a trip, and also visiting some cities, and the Borobudur, for instance. And this second trip was already when I was invested into making these collages. And that's when I also went to the Jakarta Textile Museum and the museum, and also to Sumatra, where these textiles are from. And there was quite interesting to see how these textiles are not in use anymore, but the kind of imagery you can still find in other things, like for instance in wood carvings or in bridges or in mosaics, so in other ways. And yeah, I feel like, spending time on these works and also being able to go there has given me the possibility to, meet people and also learn more about maybe my family history a bit.
Yes, I feel like a lot of this work is about an exploration of your identity and your ancestral history rather than an exploration of colonialism and the relationship between Indonesia and the Netherlands in terms of trade and being a colony and all of those things. Is it more personal for you, or do you think it's more political?
I think it's more personal for me. Yeah. I think you know, all these elements are probably there. And of course, that also makes it interesting, you know, knowing about this area. Like this was an island, Sumatra, and this island became rich through pepper trade. And that's why they could make these elaborate textiles that my motifs are based on. And then only later the Dutch and also Portuguese came in. So there is definitely also an aspect of colonialism involved. And but I do think that for me working on these, it's more a personal relationship, and also with thinking about these motifs and the thinking behind or the spiritual meaning that could maybe be found in these textiles.
Are there symbols in the textiles that are from a spiritual practice in Indonesia, or is it from your own spiritual practice?
No, so each year I make 2 of these collages based on like seasonal harvest of the tulips that season starts in April, from April till the end of May. And each year I make the motifs based on existing tampan textiles, so on the existing weavings, but they can be like maybe a mix of maybe 1 or 2 or several. But I study them and I'm thinking about what attracts me in what I see, and also in what I think it might mean or could mean now to me or to others.
And in terms of that, what does it mean to you?
Well, so that varies in the different different collages that I make. But for instance, this one that you see here, the Tampan Sessile being sacred shrine, to me feels like, and that's something that I've been kind of occupied with lately, is this. So the main motif is always the ship and this transcending from one life to another. But what you see on this collage is the ship, and the sort of prow of the ship are maybe these 2 heads of maybe ancient animals. And in the middle, there's a mountain, and from that mountain comes a bird. And for me, this tampan maybe feels for me like thinking about what's in earth, like thinking about ecological time and ancestry in animals,
Oh,
and
interesting.
mythological animals. And yeah, so that's something that I would see in this one. And also on the bottom, there's all these sea creatures, and how we are also, you know, connected to all these past creatures.
Yeah, what I particularly like about this work and some of the other collages is that the graphics, you know, it's quite graphic. The iconography is very strong, but instead of being cartoonish, it actually evokes a lot of different subtle meanings all at the same time. So someone else could come to this work and say, oh, it's a ship, it's about trade or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I came to it from this notion of an exploration of personal identity. But now
Yeah.
when you're talking about it, I can also see a kind of transportation to heaven or transportation to the next life. And it's all there in that one piece, which is an amazing accomplishment. Is it wrong to read that much into it, or do you feel
No,
comfortable with
so
that?
that's also why I like that it's a series, and that, you know, it takes time, like it evolves over years. So every year there's only 2 added. So the pace is kind of slow, which also makes it possible for me to really think about like what would be the next one to make, or how do they balance together, or how do they speak to each other? Like for instance, I think one of the main motifs is that of a ship, and on that ship you see humans, animals, and the mast of the ship is often a tree of life. And maybe so that main motif maybe speaks to maybe migration or this seeking other lives element. But then there are also others that have much more this like the one that we just saw, for instance, with this more mythical creatures kind of element, or this small ones, so these small diptychs, that's more this tree of life aspect.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about the process before we get to the floor pieces? Just the process on the wall pieces,
The process of
making them. Takes you about 4 months to make one, right?
yeah. So I set out to harvest the tulips in April, May, and for that I have this whole system of different people that I work with. Mainly I work with a hortus, the Hortus Bulborum, which is an outdoor museum or garden in the Netherlands, in Limmen, that tries to keep the whole genealogy of the tulip. So they have over 4,000 variations, going back to like the original tulips, that the original tulips grow in the mountainous areas of Turkey, Syria, Uzbekistan. That's where the original tulips come from, and they also look very different. And then the tulip was introduced to a Dutch ambassador, and then the Dutch started to cultivate tulips, and people were very invested in the tulips. And they also started to hunt tulip bulbs in that area. So the harvesting of the tulips and getting to know, for instance, this hortus, but also tulip growers in the near area, and knowing what tulips they grow and collaborating with them on the harvest. That's one part of the work. And this
Is the
is
research into that?
yeah, and this part where, visiting these different places and yearly getting to know a little more about the tulip and the growing process and where they're from. This history just kind of comes in bits and pieces, like reading a novel or something. And I dry them in my studio. I built sort of an oven for these tulips. So over these 6 to 8 weeks, I have then a kind of boxes full of dried tulip petals in sort of like color palettes. And then I start to make the collages, often with help, because it feels to me like it's kind of time sensitive, because they are very beautiful at the moment of harvesting, but they do sort of slowly fade. So I make the collages over several months, like usually till kind of like summer break starts. And yeah, it's like basically gluing and cutting the petals into these shapes of the drawing that is underneath.
I'm sorry, I got lost listening to
Yeah,
you.
sorry. No, but so when the work is finished, so then there's this process where I scan the works. And to me, that scanning the work is a way of kind of an X-ray of the work, where I try to keep the colors of that collage. So the work exists then in two variations. There's the original, which will slowly fade over time. And then there is the piezographie, the printed version, which is kind of keeping the color of that moment that I was working on these collages.
Amazing. when I asked you about influences, I was really surprised that you saw as a key influences the work of Helio Otosika and his writings.
Mhm.
And that was really fascinating to me because it goes back to almost the beginning of people doing work connecting local to global in a single piece or in an installation. Um, Talk to me about when you first discovered Otosika's work and what it meant for you in your development.
This was during art school. I don't know. I had this book from Oytechika of a show that he made in Witte de Wit, which was a art institution in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, which is now called Kunstinstituut Melli. And he had a show there. I never saw that show because I was not yet in art school. I think he made that show in the 90s. But that book was sort of a reference for me that I kept for a long time. I was kind of blown away by many things in his work. One was like how the work really has to be experienced. Like that show that he made, you really had to walk through several rooms. Like maybe one room was with water, other room was maybe with sand, and then in that sand he built sort of sets with. I think the title of that work is called Tropicana, where you're kind of, you're almost in some jungle or something, with fabrics, etc. And I was also very interested in his writing. So he writes a lot about his own works, the work that he's like working on, and his thought processes, and moving away from being influenced by Western modern art. Like for instance, his early work sort of looks like not like Mondrian, but it has a bit like, just geometric shapes. And then, moving away from that and realizing that he wanted to reflect on his own culture and his own, also political conditions then in Brazil. And so he also started making, for instance, these parangolé, which are sort of these textile capes that he would personalize for people, mostly people from his like samba group, and they became very personal kind of textiles that on the one hand they're sculpture, but on the other hand they belong with someone, and they also often have sentences written in them, and they're quite kind of meaningful and political as well. And yeah, I think his thinking influenced me. I mean, I guess I can understand how you were kind of surprised, but I
I was a
feel
little surprised only because it's a different generation from you a little bit, and also because at first I didn't get your connection to Brazilian artists, but which you seem to have a strong connection to. So, it challenged my stereotypes
yeah,
about
yeah. I
artists and
think
how they learn things and how they process things.
yeah, I think Brazilian artists were just the first artists that Oita Chica, Lydia Clark were sort of the first artists that I kind of came to understand as artists that I felt like challenged, like and thought about how a work can also maybe be activated or be, part of a performance, or and being and sculpture and having a relation to something that's happening, or the body, or yeah, this aspect. And I think, yeah, through my work I participated quite early on into my practice in the Sao Paulo biennial. So for that I also spent quite a bit of time in Brazil, and just understanding, that there's very different people than Dutch people. I think, that also kind of yeah, was
No, no, I just think, especially now, how artists receive and process influences is one of the most fascinating aspects of contemporary art to me. Because You know, when I was coming up, there was Jansen's that basically told the story of Western art, and a slight chapter at the end covering everybody else in the
Yeah,
universe.
yeah.
And now, maybe because of the internet, maybe because of travel, our influences are really diverse, strengthen the work. It's yeah, it's like really strengthens the work and its global reach. One thing about Sika that you mentioned was the notion of an installation or an environment that you walk into and around. That was very strong in your installation at Tina Kim's. And also as a site of performance. You've done numerous performances engaged with your sculpture and designs. Do I didn't ask a question, but if you want to talk about that, about an exhibition as installation or as a site for performance, I'd be really fascinated.
Yeah, so this element of thinking about how a work or an installation or an exhibition could have maybe this other moment of a challenging or an audience, you know, like I feel like an exhibition is you can come and visit, and then if there's an announced or an unannounced performance, this is another type of engaging from the public. And I was always very interested how, you know, that can also change the work. And most recently, I had an exhibition. So this was last year and the year before. I made a show at Secession in Austria, and that show also traveled to Kunstinstituut Melli. And there I made, and it's kind of related to this exhibition at Tina Kim, I made platforms, and on these platforms were, I called them shrouds, sort of textiles made from pineapple cloth. And these shrouds were kind of net-like, but they also traced sort of a body. And next to the shrouds were these, I called them shoulder pieces. And on these shoulder pieces, from cutout pineapple cloth, there were these patterns of plant-like shapes and of a sort of labyrinth-like places with kind of humans scattered in it. Very hard to explain, but the performance or this work was about, and the title of the work is Being Less Human. And so my idea was to see these, like if you go into the exhibition and you only see the shrouds, you think of that you could see the trace of a body, but it's disappeared. So it's dissolved, like, and then the thinking process is, where did it dissolve to? And when there is a performance, you know, like for instance, when the snake leaves the skin, you see that shape, and so you recognize it as that it had belonged to a snake. And in the performance, which at Secession and Melli was once a week for like an hour, there were performers underneath these shrouds, and they would slowly kind of move, and there would also maybe be moments where they would form like this cocoon-like shape. And my thinking was like, this being less human, what if, so I'm very interested in that concept, like what would it be like if we would be less human? Like what would we then be? Like for instance, when we're sleeping, we're there but we're not there. Our consciousness is somewhere else and our activities are somewhere else. So our way of how we interact with our surroundings are just much more gentle. What if instead of like when we were sleeping 7 hours a night, it would be 14 or 16 hours? Or what if it was like a year? You know, how much would that change? How much would we then start behaving differently? For me, it was also a way of thinking about, how certain animals can, change by forming a cocoon, or how this being less human for me was also a model of weaving ourselves back into ecological time and trying to reconnect to all beings around us or before us. And if we would be much more aware of this, I feel like that would make us different.
That's
Yeah.
so interesting, because often when people use terms like being less human or post-human, they have a kind of dystopian view of the future without hope that's kind of cold and less emotive than present day. And yours is so warm. Being less human means having more openness to other aspects of experience and the world. And I think that's very unique to your work, this idea of becoming more in keeping with the world, more at ease in the world by being less human rather than being robotic in the world by being less human.
Yeah. Often I want to have this kind of hopeful element in the work. I feel like that's always been something that I've been very motivated by, which I always felt like was very like not done. I always felt like, oh, work should be kind of like critical or grim, but I always wanted to make work where there's like something hopeful in the work. And for me, this being less human, like also, this moment of sleeping where you're often connecting to, like, even if you wake up from a dream, you think like, what was that? Like, what was I connecting to? Like it's like your consciousness just goes to either, like, it could go to the past, it could go into hallucinations or dreamlike states. And this what I call sessile beings. Like sessile means rooted in one place, like trees, and how they, for instance, through their root canals, communicate and have this slowness around them. I feel like that can happen also when you're sleeping, no? Like even when you're sleeping with other people in a room, for instance, you kind of feel like you're sleeping, but you're conscious of those other people. Like you're kind of, having kind of like this root systems, you're kind of making these connections.
And you
Yeah.
use a terrific phrase, a Dada phrase called souls in limbo, which I think is that what you're talking about when you say souls in limbo?
Yeah, so there was this book from André Breton called Nadja, and Nadja is often seen as one of the first surrealistic books. And in this book, there is this other person that I think André Breton, a female person that he tries to often meet with. And like it's sometimes not clear if she's a real person or if she's like a made up person. But at one moment she answers like, I am the soul in limbo. And I think when I saw that sentence, and I also started to collect that book in different languages, I'm also very interested in like in general in different languages, like how, for instance, the soul would translate to other languages. But thinking about the soul in limbo has been like sort of like a red thread in my work. Thinking about, how, for instance, if she says, I am the soul in limbo, I feel like we're constantly in limbo. Like we're constantly, if I go home to my family, I'm probably a little different than I was yesterday, or there's always something different, or you're changing, or you like how you can sometimes feel like maybe you have multiple identities, or how you are a certain person in race, or like how you're constantly moving in between. That's been kind of an ongoing subject in the work.
Well, it's so, it's interesting that for you, in between is almost a spiritual experience rather than just an identity experience. It's not just about a collision going on in your passport, but a transformation that you're open to having.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. No,
I mean,
I
when
think-
you use the term souls in limbo, do you feel identity-wise that you are in limbo because you are between two cultures or a combination of two cultures? I think you're thinking about something else when you're saying this, whereas other artists definitely saw it as an identity issue.
Yeah, and for me, this soul in limbo is all kinds of aspects. It's also aspects of the soul in limbo is also, for instance, for me, something like spirit and matter. How much of yourself is part of your body, and how much is your spirit just your spirit, like something like that has been occupying me a lot, but also how it can be related to identity, but also of how thinking of yourselves as multiple identities, or what you're identifying with, like this kind of, where all of this could be very fluid, like all these aspects I've been trying to kind of work with in different shows and different settings.
And it's felt in the fluidity you have with different mediums. Like right now, we're looking at these kind of planets that were on the wall circling the show that evoke constellations or offered, I don't know if they were real constellations or not, but they kind of offered up an interpretation as a constellation.
Yeah, they're sort of a constellation. When I was making these, I was also thinking of moon phases, the phases of the moon, but I also see them as something that, that is something that I think about often, is like, you could see the moon or the sun and then become aware that you're part of this much larger constellation where there's this relation to the atom and the cosmos, and where both of these things are so vast, like what's inside and what's outside, and where what's this constellation, I think, like, is a constant reminder again also of some sort of timekeeping, where day and night are part of these constellations, and the tides of the sea are regulated by
I was going to say
moon.
that. And in this one on the
yeah,
floor, you have the sea.
exactly. Yeah, here these two elements come together. I kind of like this image.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also with those ceramics on the wall, like thinking of how to rotate around them when you're in this space. But just getting, it's again related to this being less human element. Like, I feel like it's quite humbling sometimes too. And not only humbling, but sometimes also quite terrifying to know that there's this enormous universe that's just constantly there. And it probably wants to remind us of something.
And what do you think that is?
Yeah, of this something that, we're just like this kind of grain of sand in this larger space. Yeah, something like that.
Okay, I'm just listening, but indeed we are a grain of sand in this much larger space, as failed moon landing this week reminded us. With this, the ancestral structure, what you don't really see in this image, but is very present when you see it installed, is that it casts shadows on the wall behind it. And
Mhm.
that definitely also seems to be like your less human type material,
Yes,
where
exactly.
the material is as important as the shadows on the wall behind it.
Yeah, I think that the cutouts make for those shadows. And again, like I feel like, so that these works that we're looking at, they're called ancestral structures. So for me, it's like this tree of life, this tree of knowledge going back into this ecological time, trying to go, not only think of the ancestral tree as, you know, the grandparents, but trying to go much further into our existence. And again, there's these plant structures and the thinking of, you know, how we could think of these plant structures like those sessile beings and their way of existence. That's part of this work, but then I think like this part of the shadow creates this element, you know, where what we were earlier talking about, like what our current condition is, like being less human. I feel like is this other plane that we're on at the moment, where we're not anymore like in that same plane as nature, for instance. So I feel like, yeah, the shadow is a very important element in this work.
And this work especially, though all the work kind of raised this issue, I see, well, first of all, I didn't know what pineapple cloth was when I saw this, though it's quite beautiful and wonderful. But also, I wanted to know how much your hand is involved with this. Or do you use machinery and things like that, which would make me have a little bit different interpretation of it.
Yeah, yeah. So this these drawings, they are cut out by a machine, like a laser cut, but then they are, before that, there is the stage that the textile is in my studio and I paint them, I paint on them. Then they go to this place where they cut out all these shapes, and then I sew all these shapes together, and then I add also beads to the work.
So your hand is involved with it
as well, yes.
No, because I don't know how to say this. I may say this wrong, but the feeling of you touching everything you make also adds to the humanity of it for me, and makes it feel like a very intimate kind of encounter. Were you thinking of that?
I do often
I'm not phrasing
feel,
this right, but you know what I'm.
yeah, no, I think material is very important to me in my practice, like, and especially how to translate these ideas of philosophical ideas and these ideas around spirit and soul, how to translate these materially and also have them be experienced by, you know, someone seeing the work. And for me, that has resulted in all, yeah, working often with certain materials, like for instance ceramics or textiles, hand-dyed textiles, but also involving artisans that have helped me, for instance, with the ceramics or with the knitted works, for instance. And I think that part where there's like time spent on it and where the material is being transformed from what it was, I think adds to this kind of emotional layer.
Yeah, very interesting. And I was going to ask you, you know, we don't have many slides of your performances, but do you also want like interactivity in your performances, or interactivity with the materials by the performers, or interactivity with the audience?
Yeah,
You know,
so
how does
I
the performance affect the
yeah, so earlier on I
interaction with the
described
work?
this being less human performance, and in that situation there is no interaction with the audience in the sense of that the audience is also part of the performance, but there are also performances where the audience can maybe, for instance, with the floor pieces, for instance, the first floor piece in the first room, the blue work, the oceanic work, that work was initially made for the Istanbul Biennial. This was in 2019, and that iteration was called The Seventh Continent, and was also thinking of like how plastic waste has the size of an extra continent. And I made that floor piece, this kind of oceanic seaweed-like floor piece, kind of referring to this place that, you know, not much is known about. Like, I think only 5% of the ocean is kind of
No.
something that we know about, and others places it's still very unknown. And then this is also a place that someone who visits the exhibition can be asked to lie down on the floor piece and then be read to from a collection of I call it the eco stack of books, a collection of poetry concerned with ecology from very many different perspectives. And so that is a moment where an audience can be part of the work and kind of experience maybe these, you know, thoughts around the work.
Yeah, we're coming towards the end of our conversation and getting ready to take questions, people. But I really want to make sure we conveyed today what you feel is the important thing to take away from your show. What do you want audiences to experience when they go to your show or think about? Or you don't think about those?
That's hard to say. Like, I think I liked what you earlier said, that, you know, there's so many different ways you could maybe look at the work, or different questions that you could have, which I actually really enjoyed this element of the opening of. So 2 weeks ago, I was myself in New York for the opening, and I actually really enjoyed that there were, during this 2 hour long opening, there were just so many people asking me questions about many different aspects of the work. So I think what's already wonderful, if it can raise, you know, very different types of questions.
Yeah, that indeed is what I thought was the heart of going to this exhibition, that it led me to want to ask you all these kind of questions rather than that the work told me what I needed to think about. So,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a kind of interaction, and I really enjoy viewing art that has that element, very much. And now I got to ask you all these questions today.
Thank you, Barbara.
Yeah, Chloe, can
Yeah.
we take questions now?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for that dialogue. Jennifer, the show is brilliant and it was lovely to hear more about it. The first question today is going to be from GE. GE, I'll give you the chance to unmute and ask.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Barbara. And thank you, Jennifer. I am so taken to so many places by this work. And thank you for it. The question is, could you share perhaps, Jennifer, a moment or event that marked a significant spark of your journey as a maker?
Oh, that's a very difficult question, or not difficult. I feel like there's so many moments that I feel like could have been like this kind of spark. For one, for instance, I could like I feel like because I've been working quite a while now, over 20 years. So there's many of these kind of moments, but maybe one I think could be, in 2003, I went to Xiamen. This is in China. I had a residency there. This was next to a Buddhist temple. And I was quite intrigued by for one, this Buddhist temple, like kind of the colorfulness and these kind of different objects, these carvings, but also by people praying with these incense above their heads and the smoke swirls going up. And I was thinking about this praying, that praying is often, for me it feels like it's often you're often praying for things that maybe don't balance each other. Like on the one hand, you're hoping to travel a lot, but on the other hand, you want a stable home, for instance, and also in yourself, there could be these contradictions. So thinking about this, I felt like was quite of a strong moment where I felt like I want to make a sculpture out of that moment, which I did. I made a sculpture. It was called Empty Minds, where I tried from bamboo. I tried to make these incense sticks, very long, and on the end of these bamboos, you see these ceramic swirls with texts on them. Yeah, very often I feel like traveling has been a moment of seeing things differently, being unfamiliar, or yeah, for instance, another one was I've been to Brazil a few times, also working on one of the Sao Paulo biennials, but one of the things I was quite following was this it's sort of a religion. It's called Candomblé, and it's taken from Africans that were through slavery brought to Brazil, and they couldn't have their own faith, and this kind of mimicked Catholicism, but then integrated their own ceremonies. But very often and of course that evolved, but these ceremonies often need very daily life objects, like for instance a blue fabric, and on that you might have like balls of rice in which you would then put an offering of flowers, for instance. But they're just this visualness of kind of these ceremonial moments, and how that can maybe connect people, during, for instance, these ceremonies. I think those have been moments that I feel like have been very, very much inside of my, ingrained.
Thank you so very, very much. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thanks for that question, GE. And I loved hearing your answer, Jennifer. Next question is
Thank
going
you
to be
for this fascinating talk today. And as an artist, I'm coming at you with the process question. Essentially, the question comes because I always wonder myself, using materials and then discarding materials to make an object, and what happens to those materials and whether they get reused. And you talked about reusing materials, but I was really wondering what happens to the original piece that's made with the tulips. And of course, you talked about the decadence and how it changes and the colors, but it also is on the way to demise. What do you do with the original?
Yeah, so I find that, I've been sort of spending a lot of time thinking about what is one and what is the other, what is the original and what is this piezography, this printed version, like I've been spending quite a bit of time like how they have something in common and how they're also quite different from each other. And how do they still relate to these original textiles, you know, because these original weavings were also made by hand dyed materials, like for instance indigo or cucumber. How do you say that? Cucumber.
Cucumber.
Yeah, this yellow root. And you know, once they were vibrant, and they've also lost color. Like now, if you want to see them, you have to go, and they're hidden somewhere in the dark, and then they unroll them, and they don't have those vibrant colors that they might used to have. But then the original did have those colors, or the you know, when it was just made, this weaving I'm talking about. And so for me, the original tulip work is the one, you know, that has all the tulips on it. And that's the work that kind of fades. I see that as the archival piece. And sometimes this archival piece might be collected. And sometimes I've also offered it, for instance, to the Stedelijk Museum, while they once commissioned me to make 2 of these works. And I often wanted these 2 works to exist together, you know, preferably in a collection, like where there would be the piezography and the original. And the interesting element of the scan is the scan is light traveling through the petals. And because the petals are so thin, you very often in the scan see something different than what you see in the original, because in the scan you see maybe the translucency of the petal. So you might see already the other petals underneath. So for me, it also relates almost like some sort of like X-ray, even though the tulip petals already have so much detail. I feel like when the light travels through it, you see even more this kind of how the makeup of the petal. Yeah, so I don't know, it doesn't really answer your question, but they for me, they're part of each other, these 2 elements, the original and this printed work.
Thank you so much for that answer, Jennifer, and thank you for that question, Babs. The next question is going to be from Carolyn. Carolyn, I'll give you the chance to ask.
Hi, Jennifer. So I just was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the interactive part of your work. I was so surprised when I was putting the slideshow together to see people lying down on that sculpture, and especially the other surprise of hearing your relationship with Ilio Oichisica and how obviously interactive his work, sculpture, it seems now, right? But it of course was performance. And yeah, I would love to hear more about like your desire kind of behind inviting the audience in that way. I'm wondering about thoughts of like, you know, kind of anti-hero or ego artist, or just giving up of control, but I'd love to just hear you speak to that a little further.
Yeah, so this lying down on the floor pieces and being read to from, for instance, this eco stack of books, but there's also another one that's reading from these the resist stack of books, and this kind of came from audiences asking for this. So I made these floor pieces, and from the beginning, floor pieces were sometimes activated. Like the first ones that I made were actually for the Shanghai World Expo in 2010. For that exhibition, I made a group of vessels, and on these vessels there were titles stamped, and I translated these titles to Chinese, but I felt like it was very for me, thinking about having an exhibition in China where, you know, I cannot really communicate through English with audiences. So I was interested to translate these titles to Chinese. And then I was interested in how the Chinese writing is something between pictorial and a written language. And that brought me into thinking how calligraphy is this movement, and how maybe these texts could be also almost like a choreography. So my first choreographies came from texts, and then I started to do small choreographies based on these texts of these vessels, and that brought me to several exhibitions where I was exploring kind of movement, like choreography in relation to these floor pieces, these knitted floor pieces. But then audiences started to ask, but that they also would like to be part of these works. So from there, I came to this work where at unannounced moments, so you cannot really go and know about it, but at unannounced moments, you could be asked to lie down on the floor piece and then being read to from this eco stack of books. And this is also something that at the Tina Kim Gallery, we try to do as well. And we did that at the opening. Of course, then it was a public event, and we asked a few people from the audience if who wanted to volunteer. And I think there's also some scheduled still in the coming 2 weeks.
Thank you, Carolyn, for that question. And thank you so much, Jennifer. I'm gonna ask the last question today, if you'll have one more. My question is, one of the things that's really beautiful within the exhibition is these simultaneous explorations of symmetry and asymmetry, and both in how you think about space, but also in each of the individual works. One of the things that I noticed in walking through, especially with the Ancestral Beginnings works that hang in the wall and have the shadow to them, is that there are these little folds here and there. They're not entirely flat in how they're arranged. And it's really beautiful how there's always this sort of tension between symmetry and asymmetry in both their shapes as well as in the material, and how it naturally gives way for adjustments. And I'm curious how you think about that in your practice when you're choosing materials. So when you're thinking about a new exhibition.
So this idea of symmetry, I feel like comes from thinking about so one influence, I don't have it here, but one of the things that has been quite influential to me is this book called Tao Magic. And it's basically, it's sort of like calligraphies or Tao magic drawings. And I've used these quite a lot in my work, but they also led me to thinking about or reading these Taoist poems. And in the Tao, there's always one is always part of another. You know, the vessel is the outer space, but it's also the space that it's hold, or you know, also with the domes that I make. Sometimes they're like black and then there's white. So, and the tampons, for instance, there's a ship that's maybe on the water and it reflects. So how you would need these two elements to form a whole. I think that's where I came to, you know, working with these elements as symmetry. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so, so much for
And
today.
thank you guys for having me. It was a wonderful interaction for me today.
Nice meeting you, Barbara, and nice
Nice
meeting
meeting you,
this
Jennifer.
team
We'll
of,
stay in touch.
yeah, definitely.
It was so lovely. And thank you so much to the team at Tina Kim Gallery who were really helpful in preparing for today's event.
Yeah, definitely.
I'd also really like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor this program, The New Social Environment, and make weekday conversations like this one possible. They also support our growing archive, where you'll be able to watch this interview later on our YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation between Rafael Jablanca and Fong Bui. And as is real tradition, you all can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much.
I want to
Thank
thank
you.
also the audience, like these two
Thank
very
you.
nice people
Thank-
who've been asking me these questions. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and nice to see you, Barbara. Nice to see
Oh,
you,
nice to
Barbara.
hear
Thank
from
you, Barbara.
Thank you.
Wonderful
Okay.
seeing
you,
your work.
Jennifer.
Thank you.
Great
work.
Bye.
I hope our podcast
Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Go see the show, everybody.
Do
Please.
go see the show.
I'm coming
Thank
back
you.
tomorrow.
Okay.
Bye. Thank
Congratulations.
you.
Thank you.